In this video, I will be reviewing and comparing the various smart telescopes I've been working with for the past year or so. As of the time of making this video, all of these scopes are still widely available, and I believe they are all still the latest offerings from their manufacturers, other than the smaller S30 being offered from C-Star. Again, I'm afraid you're going to have to excuse my voice a bit. I still have a bit of a cold or whatever. I will not be trying to cover every little detail of using each of the scopes, as that would be way too much to cover in one video. I will focus on the major features of the scopes, the pros and cons of each, and my conclusions as to which offer the best power and value. I will finish by backing up my personal conclusions by showing the best images I have been able to capture with each scope. My major focus will be on deep sky astrophotography, which is my main purpose, though I will address other uses of the scopes in passing. I feel I have to start by covering the basic parameters of each scope. I apologize, this is a whole lot of numbers, but I don't believe I can review and compare the scopes without laying out and comparing these basics. The C-Star S50 is a 3-element refractor with an aperture of 50mm and a focal length of 250mm, giving it a focal ratio of f5. It uses an IMX462 sensor, producing images that cover an area of sky 0.72 by 1.28 degrees, 1920 by 1080 pixels. It can produce larger images using mosaic capture, but this takes enormous elapsed time in my experience. The pixel size of the sensor is 2.9 microns. The scope has 64 gigabytes of internal storage and a battery of 6,000 mAh capacity. Enough for a few hours work, but probably not enough for a long night in my experience, although an external power pack can easily be used. The unit weighs 5.5 pounds, Canadian price of 733 Canadian dollars, including tax. The Dwarf 3 has two lenses, a telephoto lens and a wide-angle lens. The wide-angle lens is not really relevant for deep sky photography, so I'm not going to address that. The telescopic lens has an aperture of 35mm and a focal length of 150mm, giving a focal ratio of f4.3. I'm not clear as to the exact lens type. They say it uses ED glass and is periscopic, whatever that means. Certainly it does seem to produce sharp images. This scope uses an IMX678 sensor, producing images that cover an area of sky 2.93 by 1.65 degrees, 3,840 by 2,160 pixels. The pixel size of the sensor is 2 microns. The scope has 128 gigabytes of internal storage and a battery of 10,000 mAh capacity, enough for quite a few hours. The unit weighs 2.9 pounds. Canadian price of $854, including tax. The Celestron Origin is a compound scope, somewhat similar to a Schmidt-Cassegrain. Specifically, it's a Roe-Ackermann-Schmidt astrograph, with a single mirror and a camera in the center of the front plate. The aperture is 152mm, with an obstruction for the camera, with a focal length of 335mm, giving a focal ratio of f2.2. The fastest of all these scopes by a considerable margin. It uses an IMX178 sensor, producing images that cover an area of sky 0.85 by 1.27 degrees, 3,096 by 2,080 pixels. The pixel size of the sensor is 2.4 microns. The scope has 45 gigabytes of internal storage. It uses a LiFePO4 battery, for which no capacity in milliamp-hours is given. It seems to give similar observing time to the C-Star S50. The total weight is 41.6 pounds, but this is split into 3 parts: tripod, mount, and optical tube assembly, each weighing less than 15 pounds. The optional equatorial wedge adds about another 15 pounds, but that's not included. Canadian price of $6,298 Canadian, including tax. This price included a carrying case for the optical tube and a Celestron duo-band filter, but not the equatorial wedge. The Vespera Pro is a refractor with a 4-element lens with an aperture of 50mm and a focal length of 250mm, giving a focal ratio of f5, the same as the S50. This scope uses an IMX585 sensor, producing images that cover an area of sky 1.6 degrees square, 3,536 by 3,536 pixels. The pixel size of the sensor is 2 microns. The scope has 225 gigabytes of internal storage and a battery of 10,000 mAh capacity, enough for quite a few hours. The unit weighs 11 pounds. Canadian price of 5,337 Canadian dollars including tax. This price included about $1,000 for the proprietary UHC and duoband filters, which are optional but a good thing to get. The Equinox 2 is a reflector, with the camera mounted on a spider in the centre of the open front aperture. The aperture is 114mm with a focal length of 450mm, giving a focal ratio of f4. This scope uses an IMX347 sensor, producing images that cover an area of sky 0.57 by 0.78 degrees, 2088 by 1536 pixels. The pixel size of the sensor is 2.9 microns. The scope has 64 gigabytes of internal storage and a battery of 15,000 mAh capacity. The scope weighs 19.8 pounds, split between the integrated scope and mount at 15.4 pounds and the proprietary tripod at 4.4 pounds. Canadian price of 3,375 Canadian dollars, including tax. Now I'm going to address the main pros and cons of each scope as I see them, primarily for the purpose of deep sky astrophotography. The Seastar S50 is easy to transport and to use. It can produce good images within the limits of its small native sensor resolution, and the long exposures required. It can produce much larger images using its mosaic mode, but I have not found this terribly practical given the very long capture times required, but I will show a couple of mosaics that I managed to get when I get to the images. The scope has built-in UHC and duoband filters, which is very convenient and eliminates extra expense, but you can't use filters of your own choice. It is quite modestly priced, certainly compared to much of the competition. It can do solar work and comes with an included solar filter. The greatest limitation of this scope, in my opinion, is the small native image size, meaning that its non-mosaic native images are only really suitable for viewing on screens and don't capture very fine detail. Quite long exposures will generally be required to get satisfactory results, and the capture times become enormous for large mosaics. The S50 comes with a hard carrying case and a mini tripod, but realistically you'll probably want to use it with your own tripod of choice, and it mounts with a standard 3/8" screw fitting. The Dwarf 3 is very light and easy to transport and use. It can take excellent wide-field images at a very good size, suitable for wide use, and capturing quite fine detail. Like the S50, it comes with included UHC and duoband filters and a solar filter, and is quite modestly priced. It has a short focal length and is not really very suitable for small objects, but it captures impressive wide views. Longish exposures will be required. Though rather outside the scope of this review, the Dwarf can also do excellent daytime nature photography and video. The Dwarf comes with a soft carrying case. No tripod is included. It mounts with a standard 1/4" screw fitting. The Celestron Origin is the fastest of all these scopes by a considerable margin, meaning that it is definitely the best for capturing worthwhile images without great exposure times. More exposure is better for most objects, but you can get some good results from the Origin with exposures of 10 minutes or so. This scope captures about the same area of sky as the S50, but in much finer resolution. It is most suitable for medium-sized deep sky objects, examples to follow. It takes standard filters in either 1.25" or 2" size, so you can use whatever filters you choose, but Celestron do make a specific duoband filter for it, which was included in the price I gave. The price also included the padded case for the optical tube assembly, and again I'd really suggest getting this to protect the delicate assembly during transport. This scope is of course by far the heaviest and requires the most work to set up, though nothing unmanageable. It does not have any kind of wide field or mosaic mode. It's a lot more expensive than the S50 and the Dwarf 3, and it can't do solar at all. The Vespera Pro is quite easy to transport and use, though it is surprisingly heavy for its size. It includes a carrying case, as do the S50 and the Dwarf 3. In this instance, the carrying case is very hard and well padded. It comes with a mini tripod, but realistically you'll probably want to use it with your own tripod of choice, and it mounts with a standard 3/8" screw fitting. It takes excellent square, wide-field images which are of a very good size, the largest of all the scopes, making them suitable for wide use. It has, I believe, the best optical quality of all the refractors with a 4-element apochromatic lens. It can do solar with an optional proprietary filter which is not included and which I did not get. It does have a mosaic mode to capture even wider images, but the native images are already quite wide, and I personally have never tried the mosaic mode of this scope. On the negative side, it is quite slow, requiring longish exposures, though it does seem to be able to do more in less time than the S50, despite having the same f5 focal ratio, presumably because the sensor works faster. It's definitely quite expensive, over 7 times the cost of the S50 when the UHC and duoband filters are included, as they are with the S50. This might seem almost ridiculous, but in my experience it can produce much better results than the S50. It can only use proprietary filters, so you can't make your own choice, and the filters are expensive. On the other hand, the scope automatically senses which filter is fitted, which is convenient. The frames produced by the Vespera Pro are by far the largest of any of these scopes, about 25 megabytes each, so stacking and processing takes much longer than for images from the other scopes, but you can hardly blame it for producing large, fine images. It's not quite as flexible in terms of customizing exposure parameters as most of the other scopes, but I haven't found this to be a problem. Lastly, the Equinox 2. I really find it hard to say much positive about this scope. It's fairly easy to transport and set up, but that's about the best I can say. It requires manual focusing, whereas all of the other scopes considered here autofocus well. It does include a Bartinov mask, so the focusing is not too onerous. On the other hand, it absolutely requires manual collimation and tends to keep going out of collimation, and the collimation process is horrendous. You're trying to view a small circle on the screen whilst turning the collimation screws, but if you turn a screw more than a tiny amount, the circle goes off the screen and you probably won't be able to get it back, requiring many attempts to complete successful collimation, at least for me. And even after I did my best with collimation and focusing, the images from this scope never seemed really sharp and clear. I'll show some examples shortly. This scope is also quite expensive, less than the Origin and the Vespera Pro, but much more than the S50 and the Dwarf 3, either of which would be a much superior choice in my opinion. There is no solar filter provided for it, and I don't believe it could be used for solar. So here are my conclusions. The best value for money is the Dwarf 3. It can produce excellent wide-field deep-sky images at quite a modest price. It can also do solar and fine daytime nature photography and video. It's extremely easy to transport and set up. Just a little more effort for equatorial alignment. The most capable scope overall for deep sky is undoubtedly the Celestron Origin. But of course it is the most expensive. It can capture excellent images of many deep sky objects with much shorter exposure times than any of the other scopes discussed, so it really does give you the most power if you can live with the cost. I have produced more worthwhile images with the Origin than any of my other scopes. A good economical combination would be the Dwarf 3 and the S50. You could certainly buy both of these scopes for less than the price of any of the other 3 discussed, and that would give you a wide range of abilities, so long as you can live with the small size of the basic S50 images and the longer exposures aren't too much of a problem for you. It's a bit difficult to know how to place the Vespera Pro. It's a very capable scope, quite easy to use, and it can produce excellent wide-field images in fine detail. It has the same f/5 focal ratio as the S50, but seems to work a little bit faster. It has the best sensor of any of the scopes discussed, and its optics are excellent with a 4-element lens. It also has a good battery life, and has the most internal storage, but it needs that given its large frame size. Good though it is, it's quite pricey, so I'd only recommend it after the Dwarf 3 and the Origin. Finally, the Equinox 2. I really can't see any reason to recommend this scope. It's quite expensive and by far the most difficult to use, requiring manual focus and collimation, and the collimation process, which is definitely required, is extremely difficult. And I've never been really satisfied with any of the images I've produced with this scope. I'll show the best I've been able to do shortly. Now I'm going to show some of my images. I've chosen the best that I have been able to produce with each scope. I'm most certainly not saying that these are the best images that the scopes can produce, but all of these images were captured and processed by myself using absolutely similar procedures and software, so I believe that they should serve as a good basis for comparison of the capabilities of the various scopes. I will note the exposure time for each image, as effectively exposure time is a significant cost for the user, especially if you have to observe at remote sites in often uncomfortable conditions as I do. You do need to understand that all of the images are reduced here to the resolution of this video, so I can't show their full quality. I've left the S50 single images vertically as they come, as I think this gives a fairer comparison in this video. First, some images from the Equinox 2. As I've said, I haven't really found any of my images from this scope satisfactory entirely, as compared to results from the other scopes considered here. These are the best I've been able to manage. This is M27, the Dumbbell Nebula, from 15.7 minutes, no filter. Here's my best image of M20, the Trifid Nebula from the Equinox 2. 26 minutes, no filter. Much better of this nebula to come from other scopes. Here's NGC 7635, the Bubble Nebula, from 20.25 minutes, no filter. The times with the Equinox tend to be odd, as it always shoots 4-second frames. Here's M51, the Whirlpool Galaxy, 24 minutes, no filter. I suppose these images aren't too awful if you don't compare them to anything. Here's M17, the Omega Nebula, 23.5 minutes, no filter. This is very typical of the images that seem to come from the Equinox 2. Weird colours, and clearly the scope was going out of collimation for this image, as the top left corner particularly is blurry. Turning now to the Seastar S50. First, a couple of single images. Here's M51, the Whirlpool Galaxy, from 30 minutes of exposure with the S50's IR cut filter. Here's M101, the Pinwheel Galaxy, from 32.5 minutes of exposure with the IR cut filter. Here's M31, the Andromeda Galaxy, which just about fits in the frame of an S50 single image if you get it at the right angle. This was from just 8 minutes of exposure with the IR cut filter. Here's M33, the Triangulum Galaxy, from 15 minutes of exposure with the IR cut filter. Now a couple of S50 mosaic images. Here's the Western Veil Nebula from 70 minutes total exposure with the low-pass filter. Capturing this image actually took closer to 2 hours, and it still wasn't really complete. Here's a mosaic image showing the Pelican Nebula at right and part of the North America Nebula at left. 80 minutes total exposure with a low-pass filter, and again taking around 2 hours to actually capture, and it really wasn't complete. Turning now to images from my Dwarf 3. Here's the North America Nebula from 53 minutes of exposure with the Dwarf's UHC filter. Here's an image showing the Pelican Nebula and part of the North America Nebula at left, 60 minutes of exposure with the Dwarf's duoband filter. Here's an image showing the Trifid Nebula at top and part of the Lagoon Nebula at bottom, and several other less obvious objects. This was from just 19.75 minutes with the UHC filter. so as to include reflection nebulosity. An impressive image, I think, from such a small scope. Here's the Andromeda Galaxy and its companions M32 and M110 from 25.5 minutes with the UHC filter. This one could clearly have done with more exposure, but stuff happens and that isn't always possible. Wind gets up, clouds come in, whatever. Here's an image capturing both the East and West Veil nebulae from 50 minutes with the UHC filter. I should have used the duoband filter, as the rich star field tends to drown out the nebulosity without a filter to bring it out. Now turning to the Vespera Pro. These images are actually the largest of all, but they appear smaller here due to their square format. Here's an image of nebulosity in the region around the star Sadra in Cygnus. I believe this is sometimes known as the Butterfly Nebula, although that name seems to be more commonly used for something else. This image is from 67 minutes of exposure with the Vespera's proprietary duoband filter. Here's an image of M16, the Eagle Nebula, from 17 2/3 minutes of exposure with the duoband filter. Here's an image of M17, the Omega or Swan Nebula, from 12 minutes of exposure with the duoband filter. Here's an image showing M8, the Lagoon Nebula, with the small globular cluster NGC 6544 at lower left. 44 minutes of exposure with the duoband filter. Here's an image showing pretty much the whole of Markarian's chain of galaxies. 15 minutes of exposure, no filter. Here's an image showing the Trifid Nebula and surrounding region. 12 minutes of exposure with the duoband filter. Using the duoband filter here was a mistake, as it suppressed the reflection nebulosity, which is such a feature of the Trifid Nebula. Here's the Western Veil Nebula from 16 1/3 minutes of exposure with a duoband filter. In this case, using the duoband filter was definitely correct, as it's brought out the delicate nebulosity while suppressing the rich star field. Finally, from the Vespera Pro, this image was intended to show the Wolf-Rayet star WR134 with its arc of unusually coloured nebulosity. 56 minutes of exposure with the duoband filter. The duoband filter has brought out a lot of surrounding hydrogen emissions whilst rather suppressing the special Wolf-Rayet emission arc, which can be just seen above and right of centre. This target is difficult, as with no filter the rich star field really tends to drown out the nebulosity in long exposures, but with the duoband filter, as you can see here, the Wolf-Rayet emission doesn't come out too well. Finally, turning to the Celestron Origin, which has undoubtedly given me more results that I felt were successful than any of my other scopes. Here's Drea's Nebula IC447 from 15 minutes of exposure with no filter. Here's the Lagoon Nebula from 25 minutes of exposure with no filter. The small reflection nebula IC4678 can be seen at top left. And here's an image with IC4678 centred and part of the Lagoon Nebula at bottom right. Dark nebulosity is also prominent in this image. 10 minutes of exposure, no filter. Here's an image showing the Leo triplet of galaxies, M65, M66 and NGC 3628, from 10 minutes of exposure, no filter. Here's an image of the Omega or Swan Nebula from 15 minutes of exposure, with the Celestron duoband filter. Here's an image of NGC 6888, the Crescent Nebula, from 10 minutes of exposure with the duoband filter. This image shows the brightest nebulosity quite well, but could have benefited from more exposure. Here's the Eagle Nebula with the Pillars of Creation at its centre, from 15 minutes of exposure with the duoband filter. Here's an image of an interesting and lesser-known nebula IC405, known as the Flaming Star, showing an engaging combination of emission and reflection nebulosity. 20 minutes of exposure, no filter. Here's another image of objects not very well known. The emission nebulosity at centre, which looks like a faint version of the Cocoon Nebula, is catalogued as IC1284. The two small reflection nebulae to the right are catalogued as NGC 6589 and NGC 6590. 30 minutes of exposure with no filter. These nebulae are quite faint. Here's M51, the Whirlpool galaxy, from 30 minutes of exposure, no filter. This is the best I've managed of M51, but more exposure would of course have produced better results. 30 minutes of exposure, no filter. Here's M101, the Pinwheel galaxy, from 20 minutes of exposure, no filter. This image shows many star-forming regions in the M101 galaxy, and also shows the gravitationally associated dwarf galaxy NGC 5477, just below centre right. Here's an interesting combination of galaxies together with a prominent coloured star. The star is HD 121197. The pair of interacting galaxies below are NGC 5353 and NGC 5354. The spiral galaxy to the left of the star is NGC 5350. Below that are two very small galaxies, NGC 5355 and NGC 5358. The larger spiral galaxy at lower left is NGC 5371. 4 of the centre galaxies and the spiral at lower left are actually gravitationally associated and are known collectively as the Big Lick group. This image is from 10 minutes of exposure with no filter. Here's an image of reflection nebulosity near to the star Sadra in Cygnus from 20 minutes of exposure with no filter. The whole region around Sadra, which itself is not included in this image, is rich in emission nebulosity, and it's hard to sort out designations for the various parts. This image was actually targeted on the star HD 194789. Finally, from the origin, here's what I believe is my best image to date of the Trifid Nebula, from just 10 minutes of exposure with no filter, so as to bring out both the emission and reflection nebulosity. Well, if you stuck it out this far, I hope you've found some of this interesting or informative. As I noted at the start, I could say much more about the features and quirks of the various scopes. I've focused here on the factors I thought most significant. If you have any questions about my experiences with any of these scopes, or about any of the images shown, please post in the comments below, and I will do my best to respond. Until the next time, clear skies.